The National Association of Counsel for Children advances children's and parents' rights by supporting a diverse, inclusive community of child welfare lawyers to provide zealous legal representation, and by advocating for equitable anti-racist solutions co-designed by people with lived experience. Learn more at naccchildlaw.org, counselforkids.org, and at our National Child Welfare Law Conference in Cleveland this August.
Hello and welcome to the Imprint Weekly Podcast. I'm John Kelly, Senior Editor of The Imprint, a daily news site covering child welfare and youth justice around the country. You can read all of our coverage at imprintnews.org or check us out on Facebook or Twitter at The Imprint News. You can also sign up on our homepage for our free weekly and monthly newsletters. And for professionals in child welfare and youth justice, subscribe to our Youth Services Insider section for a closer look at news on business policy and practice. The Imprint Weekly Podcast is also a member of the Safe Camp Audio Network. Check out our show page and all of Safe Camp's other great podcasts at safecampaudio.org on the web, at Safe Camp Audio on social media. On this week's episode, Michael Tanana, founder of Lyssn, joins to talk about artificial intelligence, or AI, in the child welfare system. We have had guests on the podcast before to talk about this, and as I joke early in the interview, I expect that we'll probably have an annual check-in on AI in some form here, since it certainly seems inevitable that AI's role in the execution of the child welfare system will grow. Tanana helped found Lyssn, which uses AI to help assess the quality of various services in a way that used to require painstaking transcription and note-taking, really was only ever done as part of research. So we talked to him about, just starting an AI company in this space, what goes into that. Also about his views around the ethical application of AI in a system where the integrity of families is often on the line, and just more about generally the future of artificial intelligence, both in this system and overall. So without further ado, here is our conversation with Michael Tanana of Lyssn. All right, we are joined today by Michael Tanana, Chief Technology Officer for Lyssn, for our biannual conversation on this podcast about the role of artificial intelligence, you know it as AI, in child welfare and human services. Mike, thanks for joining us on the Imprint Weekly Podcast.
John, thanks so much for having me. It's really great to be here. Really respect the podcast, and I'm really excited to talk about AI in child welfare.
So house rules here on this podcast. Got to get these guys to know you a little bit before we get into it. So I'm going to ask you to give me at least one favorite in these categories: movie or TV show, book, musical group, or sports team. Mike Tanana, what do you have for the people?
Okay, so I'm going to pick a movie.
Okay.
I'm a huge movie lover. I don't watch a ton of TV, but my wife and I watch a movie almost every single night.
Wow.
We lived in Utah for years, and so we would always go to Sundance and see as many films as we could, when they came through. And so it makes the question a lot harder to pick a favorite. And so it's really putting me to the test. I change on probably a weekly basis, but I think there's a good argument to be made that Pulp Fiction is maybe the best movie ever made. I mean, I could have picked any of the Tarantinos, but it's one that's lasted a while, right?
It's a hard choice to argue with. Definitely, it would be on my top 10 list no matter what. And I think there'd probably be some other Tarantino movies on there too.
Yes, definitely the Tarantinos. But weirdly enough, I think when it comes to like on the time axis, one that's lasted the longest and is still maybe in the top 5, I think Dr. Strangelove.
Okay. And appropriate for our political times a little bit.
Very
indeed. A movie a night is really something, man. That's a real commitment to film over TV. We're all out here just binging some crazy range of reality shows, sports, and TV shows.
And it's such a continuum now, right, between TV and films. But so if I were, and then if I were to pick a book, it's going to be a Cormac McCarthy I'd probably either pick The Road or No Country for Old Men. I think The Road is probably my favorite.
Very cool. Good recommendations. Thank you for those. So now you are a tech executive in the human services space, and we'll talk to you about your experience and all that stuff. But my understanding is you got started on the service side here, right? Your first gig was working in residential program.
Yeah, my first job out of college, my first real job. I had a brief stint in landscaping. My first real job out of college was working residential in a juvenile justice placement in northern New Hampshire. And it was a really great experience. I was really just line staff, so I was there, staffing the house and working with the kids, and I'd spend basically the whole weekend at this residential placement, and it was a really great experience. Also, a really hard experience. I think it gave me an appreciation for how difficult the work is that people in health and human service do. It's just really challenging.
I'm just now catching up to maybe irony is not the word, but we'll get into a little bit of Lyssn here and sort of what you guys do. But on a big picture, you're assessing the quality of delivery of pretty complex things. And your first job was going into a place where one might do that, thrown into the fire as, like, I'm guessing, a 22-year-old or something like
that. Exactly.
Right?
And it's well, and the way I think about it, I wish when I was there we had some of the tools that we've been working on at Lyssn, because the training that you get when you work in those places is all on documentation, compliance. And then in a juvenile justice placement, they spend a lot of time teaching you how to restrain a kid. What you don't ever get training on is how to talk to a kid, how to have a listening conversation. You didn't learn skills like motivational interviewing because only people they could afford to train in that were the MSWs who spent maybe an hour or two with the kids every day.
When was motivational interviewing first kind of established as a practice?
Oh, that's a good question. I think I'm not an expert on it, but I want to say it was somewhere in the late 70s, early 80s. And it was basically, you had Rogerians, right, that were like, these a school of thought of psychotherapy that were practicing these listening skills. And when the evidence-based treatment movement began, they basically had to figure out a way to mash Rogerian psychotherapy into what we call now EBPs, right? Basically something replicable, something where you could like create a manual and teach people how to do it. And that's what became motivational interviewing. And it's, in my mind, motivational interviewing is such an amazing evidence-based treatment because it's not like CBT where it's constrained to like a psychotherapy office. Motivational interviewing is just like, it's a great life skill. You can teach the person that's sitting at the front desk motivational interviewing, you can teach line staff motivational interviewing, or you can teach, a highly trained therapist motivational interviewing. And it's useful in all of those settings, which makes it a really powerful tool. And it's also one of the best research evidence-based treatments out there that we just have thousands and thousands of papers on the efficacy in all of these different settings.
Yeah, it certainly was I think it was the first service that, when they passed the Family First Act, which we've talked about myriad times, I'll drop a link in the show notes for people who want to catch up if they don't know that. But lots of services to help prevent foster care. And I think the first one I remember getting, the top level assessment, was motivational interviewing. And I'm pretty confident it's the one I've seen in the most state plans too, which I guess you could look at and say, well, is that because it's easy to implement or is it, this is what states are really starved for? They really do want to tap into it.
Yeah, I think that's accurate. I think it's in the most state plans. And in addition to that, and I don't have statistics to back this up, this is anecdotal, but they're rolling it out with the most people. Mm-hmm. When they roll out things like TFCBT, they're picking really narrow groups where they're planning to use it. When people are using motivational interviewing, they're training all of their caseworkers in it. They're trying to train a really wide swath of people that are interacting with families. And I think the reason they pick it is because it's like, think about something like TFCBT again. That's a manualized treatment that might happen in a psychotherapy office. When you're a caseworker, you can be using motivational interviewing when you're going out and visiting a family, to really be listening to them, to trying to understand their problems, to help them, get to a good resolution that isn't foster care for their kids. And so I think that's why you're seeing it in so many of these plans.
So let's talk a little bit about your guys' experience from the context of, I think it would be kind of interesting for a lot of people. A lot of people that listen to the show, work in child welfare, youth justice, around it, or maybe they're just interested. That's largely dominated by government and nonprofits, individuals, things like that. And you're kind of part of this new fleet of for-profit companies that are coming in to try and do a service within this sector. And I think that's kind of like, there's not a lot of, I think people would be interested to just see how that all comes together and understand the business of AI in human services context here. So, let's start with you explaining what Lyssn does, because I did a pretty rudimentary take on that at the top, but then you could do that and sort of talk about how the idea came together, how you guys, the founders, found each other to do it. And what I'm particularly interested in is how did you ascertain that nobody else was already working on it? I always wonder that about businesses. Go ahead.
Yeah, those are great questions. So Lyssn started when we were all university professors, and we were doing NIH-funded research on this question of, could we actually take just a recording of a behavioral health treatment session and basically figure out what the quality of the services being delivered was, right? And this research we've been doing for, something on the order of 8 or 10 years before we started Lyssn. But we were really just trying to understand if these algorithms could really accomplish that goal. And then at some point, somewhere around the time of 2016, 2017, we started to figure out that, like, oh yeah, we can actually really do this and do this effectively and do it well. And by this, I mean, it's like, the way that we used to assess the quality of behavioral health treatment is that you'd have a pen and paper tool. Someone would be sitting there listening to a full-length session, a 50-minute session, and be checking things off. And at the end, you would get a score. And basically, the only time that quality assessment ever happened was in research studies, because it was so expensive, it was so time-consuming, it was so slow. And we really wanted to figure out, like, can we scale this up? Can we do this, with hundreds of thousands of sessions, millions of sessions? And somewhere around the time of 2016, 2017, we started to figure out, like, yeah, we can really kind of do this well. And we've been publishing a lot up to that point. And so you can go back and read all of our old papers when we really couldn't do it that well, and at that point started to do it well. And so, we were in the position of a bunch of academics trying to figure out how to start a company, which is kind of funny. We were hopelessly naive in a lot of different ways. I'd done lots of work developing software for behavioral health companies, child welfare organizations, for state and local government. And so I had some background, but really a startup was a new thing to us. And so when we started this company, no one was selling AI products anywhere. This was before sort of the AI craze, where now basically every product advertises some kind of AI function.
Were you even at the time thinking of your venture as AI at this point? Or were you just simply at the idea of, could we just record things and make this easier somehow?
We wouldn't frame it in that way because no one understood what that was, or people weren't looking to buy AI, or people didn't understand what the capabilities of these models were. We would basically say we use technology to rate the quality of behavioral health services, and that's what we advertise. And, when we started, it was funny because there weren't a lot of people that were looking to buy services for those kinds of things. But, Family First was one unique area where there was this critical problem that had just started, right? Which is that, in the Family First Prevention Services Act, it's really the first federal law that had a robust requirement for monitoring the quality of services being delivered. And so all these states that wanted to participate in Family First had this real challenge. And a lot of them, I'm sure you talk to people, use pen and paper initially. and realized that it was just really hard to make that scale. And so it was really, fortuitous events that our company was starting up. This law had just started, and we were lucky enough to find some people that were willing to take risks on this kind of technology. And after a couple of successful rollouts, it really started to build momentum.
So you guys really started with no known customer base. I mean, you guys are just a bunch of guys who thought, man, we do this sporadically for evaluation and research, but nobody's doing ongoing assessment. We should build that, and they'll just and have faith that people will want it if we build it.
Yeah, it was kind of a wild proposition, and one that I think most investors thought was hopelessly naive at the time. Because no one, in some ways, there weren't a lot of problems that we were solving. Our first customers were psychotherapy clinics that liked the fact they could record their trainees and get some rating of quality and would call on specific moments and sessions. And so it was a bit of a wild stab in the dark. And I think naivety helped, because I think if we did more experience, we might not have started the company. But we've, over time, we really started to find these niches where people really cared about quality. And, the interesting part that I don't think a lot of people know is that it's really public health and human services where you actually see people that care about quality. They want to measure quality. They've got reporting requirements around quality. And it's the private sector, I think, you don't see that as often. You're starting to see it more in some of the larger behavioral health organizations. But, all of our first customers tended to be public health and human service. And so we had public mental health clinics that tried some of the stuff out that used to be doing pen and paper. We had a couple of child welfare agencies that were our early customers. And it was really after people figured out that it actually works and can actually do what we said it did, that we started to really, ramp up and build a much larger customer base. Now I think we have something like 70 plus institutions that use Lyssn in different capacities. We've done studies with groups like Talkspace, where we analyzed something like 1 million sessions from Talkspace paired with outcomes and published the results on how those metrics that we measure actually correlate with things that people care about, like retention, like symptom reduction. And so, now I think we're going beyond the early adopters and starting to see that it's starting to become more of a standard of practice. But I think it helps that we aren't business people, that we are people that come from behavioral health. All of the founders are psychologists who have been working in these areas for their whole careers. And we care about this quality problem, right? We really care about the quality of behavioral health treatment and how we can make it better.
This question is going to come across fairly stupid because I'm a Luddite. I don't know much about AI, as most people don't, right? When you build an AI company, when you build a company that is going to assess, millions of sessions through a learning machine model, what is it that you have to build? What do you acquire to build something, and what ultimately is it? Because I think I still just think of this big mainframe enormous computer, even though it's not real, so what is it that you guys had to build to create Lyssn?
Yeah, I mean, so the interesting parts that we talk a lot about are the algorithms, right? These machine learning algorithms, but it's not just the rating of fidelity. So there's all of these different components where it's at the very end, the fun part that we get to do is we're replicating human judgment. So we're training on human judgment on where we have a team of humans who have been rating these different tools, and we train machine learning algorithms to replicate what those humans do. But we have to do a bunch of steps before that, right? We have to, in order to take an audio file and rate those metrics, we have to first record that file, have a way to stream it securely to a HIPAA compliant server. Once we get that file, we have to transcribe the whole thing. We have to figure out who is speaking when, who's the provider, who's the client, right? And then at the very end, we get to do the rating of quality metrics. And so there's all these different components that come together, right? So we have people that are just working on the user interface, right? Which is basically the web browser interface where you're interacting with these products, right? We've got server-side engineers that are responsible for making sure that the data is consistently streaming back to our servers and being stored securely in a HIPAA-compliant way. And then we've got machine learning folks that are actually constantly building these models, again, that are replicating human judgment on these quality rating instruments. And so it's just this sort of this long block of different things that you have to put together. But it's, I think what separates us from some other companies is that we don't outsource the development of all those algorithms. And so we're not secretly using like ChatGPT in the background. These are all algorithms that we've been developing and working on for a decade. And they're things that we ourselves manage and that we keep in our secure environment so that we never have to hand off, that very sensitive data to third parties.
I'm assuming you're contracting or you're getting business from organizations or counties or whatever. But for the actual provider of a therapy or motivational or whatever it is, do they have to keep going out and training them on anything, or for them is what you do as simple as I have to turn this thing on so that it records, or do they actually have to interact with Lyssn? And then in the other kind of second part of that, for the patient, are they always given a chance to opt out? I mean, this is at some level, their private thoughts being put into something that, you're saying it's privately secured, but I'm sure people freak out about that. Not everybody, but some people, right? So
the cool thing is we actually have a bunch of different ways that we package that underlying technology, and some of them where you don't even need to record a patient. And so the way a lot of child welfare organizations interact with our product is that they not only use it to monitor the quality of their services, they use it to train their workers. So we have a platform where you can take that same technology that can rate the quality of a session and use it to train people. And so unlike most training, you've probably done these horrible online trainings where you're sitting there and you're just looking at slides and you answer a multiple choice question at the end. What our platform does is that it's basically very brief didactic content that explains what motivational interviewing is and how you use it. And then it's all built around practice with simulated patients. So you get these patient vignettes where they're talking about issues they're dealing with, where they're talking about what it's like to be in foster care. And then you actually speak to the platform and you get an immediate rating of what you've done. Like, good job, that was a great open question, or that was actually a closed question. You should try doing it more like this or that. And so a lot of the child welfare agencies never have to put client data on our servers, which is really nice, right? So they don't have to worry about some of that confidentiality. And then they use that platform on an ongoing basis to keep practicing those skills. So they're both practicing and getting feedback, and the agency is getting a continuous rating of whether they actually are retaining those skills on an ongoing basis.
So you can actually assess how a session went only hearing half of the session, just what the asker is asking and not what the sayer is saying.
Well, yeah, because they're interacting with a simulated client, right? And so we get both sides of the session, but it's not, they don't have to necessarily interact with a real client. And then we have people that do role plays with other people, so they don't have to put client data on where they have to do so many role plays, but you get that same kind of feedback. And then you get some people that are monitoring real sessions with real clients. So when they're talking with the client, they're doing a motivational interviewing session, they're sending that to our platform. And then the cool part is that we can delete that session after 30 days or 90 days or however long the agency wants. And so we're really flexible when it comes to data retention so that people who have very stringent data requirements, they can still use the platform, right?
So just to finish out on that, if I was a patient and I was in the room of a provider who is part of a contract with Lyssn,
yeah,
am I told, by the way, this is being recorded for training purposes, and do I then have well, I guess this isn't really your choice, this is theirs, but is your sense that that person could be like, absolutely not? And
Every one of our providers has an opt-out, right?
Okay.
They normally have consent processes that, again, they have to develop it in ways that meet their state laws and their policies, but they almost all go something like, this is assessing me and the quality of my delivery of services, but you're welcome to opt out. And so everyone from psychotherapy clinics to child welfare workers, they all have sort of that opt-out procedure. And again, some people don't even record clients, and then that is a great way to protect client data, is not even having to send that to the server.
Before I was adopted, I felt like my life was already over.
My biggest fear was that I would age out and not know how to be sufficient on my own.
At a certain age, like, they don't want you, you're troubled and stuff.
The clock is ticking for the more than 125,000 kids waiting to be adopted from foster care. Help the Dave Thomas Foundation for Adoption prevent them from aging out without a permanent family. Learn more at davethomasfoundation.org.
So one thing you guys do that's interesting is you conduct a bias report every year to see if, I'm assuming the main thing you want to see is if Lyssn works pretty equally, regardless of whether the race or ethnicity of the provider that's being assessed is different. So how has that been received, and what have you learned from that thus far?
Yeah, so the bias report is something that I think is really, really important to us as a company. Way back when I started my research career, some of my first publications were around a bias in adult offender assessments. And these were pen and paper tools, right? Whatever kind of psychometric or assessment tool you're using has the potential for bias. If it's a pen and paper tool, if it's a human being making a decision, or if it's an AI tool, all of those things have the potential for bias. And so, any responsible group should be conducting these analyses. And so what we do on an annual basis is we get a selection of providers from, REM populations, majority class populations, and then we look to see what the performance is of our algorithms on all of those different populations. And then we try to make sure that there isn't a major difference between those different groups. But we publish all of the details online. And so you can pull it up and you can look at like the scientific details of how those algorithms do on really fine-grained codes that we rate in the platform, and see how we do differently with, for example, REM populations and non-REM populations. So I think anyone that is producing an AI algorithm that is doing something important in the life cycle of a case needs to be assessing for bias. And, I think about our product the way that you might think about an FDA-approved drug, right? If your doctor recommended a drug to you, that's an FDA drug, you could go online and you could probably look up something on the order of 10 or 20 studies at least on that drug. You could see what the side effects were. You could see what the outcomes were for patients that use the drug. And I think, honestly, in 10 or 20 years, that will be the standard of practice for artificial intelligence products, because people are going to discover that when you just roll something out without testing it, without measuring it, that it can harm people. It has the potential for harm, even though the results look correct. We know now that AI is famous for producing things that look correct, but aren't, right?
That look correct, but aren't.
Yeah. So have you ever heard about things like this where attorneys have used AI to like write briefs for them? And what does it do? It writes a brief that looks great, but it'll make up citations, right? Mm-hmm. So that's an example from generative AI, right? Which is a little different from what we use. It's mostly classification AI, right? But you can make something that to an observer, just like on its face, it's like, oh, this looks like a valid legal brief. But what you don't realize is that those citations that look correct and look like they could be citations can be hallucinated. And so that's what I mean by rigorously testing, not just the base algorithm, but really the use case that you're using it for, right?
Do you think it's possible to quantify or isolate bias in any AI system?
I think in child welfare, I wish more people would look at what juvenile justice does when they assess bias. In child welfare, most of the times when people are thinking about bias, they do a one-time study and they look at some statistics and then they move on. In juvenile justice, for decades, states that receive certain federal money have to look at bias in every stage of their system, arrest, intake, charge, conviction, transfer to adult court. In all of those different areas, there's so many ways that bias works its way into their system. It's not just human bias, right? There's socioeconomic bias, right? It's where people who can't afford attorneys, right? People who can't understand the language of court documents. It's this myriad system, and there's a lot of ways for bias to work its way in. And so I don't think that that's something that you finish. I think it's a process that you have to do on an ongoing basis to really to do it well. And we're not going to get to a point where we're done. But that's true of humans as well, right? It's like when you've got humans that are doing things in the world, you never get to the bottom of exactly the factors that influence things like the child welfare system, because it's complicated. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't try because it's complicated. It means that it's just an ongoing process that you always have to be improving.
I would love your opinion on, given what you just said, whether the bias potential and presence in AI is particularly unique compared to the risk of bias and presence of bias anywhere else. I think of there's one paper on this subject in the child welfare space called Calculating the Souls of Black Folks. It's really an interesting read by J. Khadija Abdur-Rahman. I'll drop a link to anybody who wants to read it. But I think she said it the most bluntly. I'll just read a little bit of it and then get your thoughts. She wrote, "Those who know all too well the prejudice of the frontline caseworker, the juvenile detention center, family court employees might be incredulous at the suggestion we ought to defend racist institutions from having their decision-making capacity eroded by the introduction of these obscure and obscuring computational infrastructures." I'm not going to read the entire thing, but to summarize, and it is worth a read. It's not a long paper. She's basically saying, like, I'm not critical of AI because I think what we have is great. I just know how I can put what we have in check. I know the ways to challenge it. And the scary thing about AI is it's just this black box a lot to people. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I think, and going back to your original question, I think that this applies equally to AI and human beings, right? That these systems are really complicated. And the same way that AI can be a black box, the human mind is also a black box. It's a black box to individuals. I mean, I don't know if you've ever read some of the social psychology on implicit bias, right? About they do these studies where you have a different racial or ethnic person doing an interview, and they measure how far away people put their chairs. And it's like, are the people who are doing that conscious that they're systematically moving their chairs further away from African American interviewers? Probably not. Do they know the reasons? I don't think they would be able to report the reasons, and I don't know that there's a way that we can know that. And so in the same way that AI is a black box, like human beings are a black box too, but understanding the why of bias, I don't know in an AI model that you necessarily need to know the underlying root cause to effectively measure the outcome, which is how far you're putting that chair, right? Or what your actions and your decisions are. And if you're consistently measuring actions and decisions and being critical of them, not measuring them from a perspective of we're always right, then at least you've got a shot. I think that people shouldn't feel threatened by measuring bias in humans, bias in AI algorithms. I don't think that this used to be as much of a political issue as it is today. I remember Hillary Clinton said in a debate back in 2016 where the question was, are you biased or are you racist? And she said something like, we're all biased, and that's what the research shows, is that we're not just biased against racial or ethnic groups. You're biased against people that are from your town versus not from your town. Bias is sort of an artifact of the heuristic thinking that human beings have, and so we have to guard against it. You have to measure it. It's not going to go away. We're not going to solve it. And we have to be really aware of it. I mean, my wife is Navajo. My kids are members of the Navajo Nation. My father-in-law was forced to go to what we call now boarding schools, but were really like essentially re-education camps. And it's just horrifically traumatic experience for him to be removed from his family and forced to go to these schools where they were just really badly abused. And so, bias is a real thing. You don't have to think about it academically to look at our child welfare system and realize the ways that it works its way into there. But all that to say is that, like, we need to improve and we need to do better, and it's an ongoing thing, and it shouldn't be a political issue because bias works its way for everybody, right? People are biased against all sorts of people for all sorts of different reasons, and so it's something we should constantly be mitigating.
It always feels like these conversations about AI get too biased, and that it's like that's the only concern anybody ever has. Are there other things, aspects of this technology, what you're doing, what other people are doing, that concern you more or equally about our future?
My real concern is that companies don't think about ethical AI or responsible AI, that there aren't people that are interested in measurement or think about rigorously testing their algorithms before they release them on the wild. They're just slapping AI on a product and putting it out there. And my real concern is that, like, AI, if it's done well, if it's done responsibly, if it's done carefully, it can make the lives of caseworkers easier. It can make it better. It can take things off of their plate so that they can focus on what they're good at, human interactions, right? It can make it so we can better handle turnover in our system, right? But if we get companies in there that really aren't experienced at this, that haven't spent decades really carefully analyzing the outputs of these systems, that in some ways it's going to poison the well, and people just won't want to do it, and people are going to shut down. And those opportunities to enhance caseworkers, to make them better at their jobs, to make their jobs less monotonous, aren't going to reach them. I mean, that's a real concern that I have. I mean, if you go to Health and Human Service conferences, every single advertisement has AI tagged on the end of it. And there are very few players that I know in the field that really know how to do it responsibly, that have been doing it for a long enough time to understand the risks and the benefits.
Who going the other way, who really impresses you in this space? If you could, who are some people doing AI stuff in child welfare or behavioral health that are really exciting to you?
I really like what AugIntel is doing. Do you know AugIntel? Yeah, I think they're another example of a responsible AI player. They've been doing it before it was like what everybody slapped on their poster board. They basically they analyze like all of the case notes in a system and can turn those into charts and graphs so that an administrator can basically, look at hundreds of thousands of case notes really quickly. And so I think in our space, that's one of the better examples I've seen of people that really take AI seriously, that it's not just a marketing campaign, that it's actually like, built a little bit into the core of their business.
Yeah. The Biden administration kind of took a crack, I think, at starting to put some rules in place around this.
Yeah.
When it came to, at least when it came to processes that, people might actually affect people's lives with livelihoods. I think that's an executive order that's already been rescinded. Do you think that the federal government should be setting standards for AI use, and like how would they do that? In your mind, like what do we need at that top level to get set in stone?
So yeah, what the Biden administration was doing, I really liked those rules. I mean, I think it fit with our own internal processes about how we think about AI. The way that particularly in healthcare or behavioral health, that we should think about it not quite like an FDA approved drug, but kind of in some analogous way, right? Where there's some requirements around publication, around rigor, around evaluation. And so I thought that those rules were a move in the right direction. Incidentally, a lot of states have adopted processes a little bit like that or derived from some of those rules. And so now most of the compliance processes that we go through, we're starting to see some of that methodology. And part of that methodology is first asking, what's the risk of this going wrong, right? So think about the Allegheny County, the risk of saying a child is safe when they're not safe, that's a huge risk, right? Saying that a counselor was able to use an open reflection when they were really not is a slightly lower risk. And so I think assessing for the risk of mistakes is a really good first step. And then thinking about the algorithms and how you measure them. Do you have any reported outcomes? We're starting to see that more and more in states. And so I think that's a good thing. And it seems to be a bipartisan thing, that this isn't something where red states or blue states do something different. I think states are just realizing there's a lot more AI being rolled out, and so we need to have some processes the same way that people have processes around IT infrastructure, right? If you send HIPAA compliant data to a third party, you got to make sure that it's safe, that you can prove that you're handling it safely. I think there's no reason that there shouldn't be compliance processes like that around artificial intelligence as well.
Are you of the mind that AI will advance progressively to where, one day it's going to jump from, in your guy's space, assessing to acting? Like now it's helping you assess motivational interviewing. Do you think someday AI might be better at actually administering motivational interviewing than a human would be? Or
that's a good question. I mean, I think you're going to start to see things around the edges where generative AI might, imagine when you're calling a call center. Maybe at some point you can imagine AI using motivational interviewing to be a more helpful call answerer. It's hard to imagine that you're going to see AI taking the job of a caseworker, at least not based on what I'm seeing right now. I mean, when people invented the calculator, I think it blew people's minds and they weren't quite sure where it was going to stop. And I think we're in that phase right now where it's like, oh my gosh, this AI is doing things that we thought before only humans were going to be able to do. But, with most technologies, you're going to hit a plateau, and then people are going to try to figure out what's the niche of these different tools. And calculators replaced some human jobs. And so I think that is going to happen. I mean, the way that we see the role of AI is much more around enhancing human beings, right? Anything that's rote, anything that's repetitive, I think those are the things that we're going to try to take off people's plates first, so that human beings can do the things that human beings are good at. And so I think that's what I see as the near future. It's hard to make predictions right now, though, because technology changes really quickly, but it would not surprise me if this technology plateaus a little bit. I don't think it's going to take every job out there. I think if jobs are repetitive, I think if they don't involve a lot of human creativity, I think we could see those jobs go away or transform, right?
What do you, as somebody who's very familiar with how this works, daydream or whatever about AI playing a role in that we can't even comprehend today? Like what aspect of behavioral health and supporting families might we just have a revolution in Like, we're just not even playing in that space right
now. That is a good question. There's so many things that I dream about floating around in my mind. And so that's probably a conversation in and of itself. I mean, this is going to sound kind of sad. I think, you get people in the media that are thinking about like AI is going to, take these whole industries and just completely 100% automate them. The things I fantasize about is like that case note that a person writes at the end of a visit that's monotonous and boring and they have to do before they get home to their kids. That's just going to be written for them. They're going to read it once and approve it. Honestly, I think that's the stuff that excites me, is the stuff about your job that you hate, is boring, that isn't the reason why you took the job, but it's something that you're forced to do as part of the job. I think those things are going to go away, and human beings are going to get to do what human beings are good at.
Michael Tanana, Chief Technology Officer for Lyssn, thank you for joining us on the Imprint Weekly Podcast.
John, thanks so much for having me.
Thanks to Michael Tanana of Lyssn for joining us today, and thanks to the National Association of Counsel for Children for sponsoring this episode. The Imprint Weekly Podcast is a production of the Safe Camp Audio Network, which is a division of Fostering Media Connections. You can visit safecampaudio.org on the web or at safecampaudio on all major social media. This podcast is produced and mixed by Christine Onjoko with music by Luke Giroux and Cyrus Elia. If you enjoyed this episode, we would love it if you would consider subscribing or giving us a 5-star rating on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you download your podcasts. And we would greatly appreciate if you consider supporting our work here on the podcast and in print. Small donations from our listeners and readers go a long way towards helping us grow and cover more great stories in child welfare and youth justice. To support us, it is very easy. You just visit imprintnews.org/donate. You can follow The Imprint on Twitter and Facebook by searching the handle @TheImprintNews, and visit us on the web at imprintnews.org. You can get us over email at tips@imprintnews.org. I'm John Kelly, and we'll see you next week.